and welcome to the Seward House Museum. My name is Reagan and I'm an intern here this summer. I'm so excited to be taking you on our specialty women's tour today. While we all know that Mr. Seward was a very distinguished politician, he was New York State Senator, U.S. Senator, and Secretary of State under Lincoln and Johnson, the truth is that there were some very important women behind him every step of the way. Using family correspondence and journals, we've put this tour together to give you a deeper insight into the women in Seward's life, including Frances, Fanny, Lizette, Anna, and Janet, and other local notables, including, of course, Harriet Tubman. Today we're starting in the front parlor of the Seward House Museum, where I'm going to introduce you to Mrs. Frances Seward. Frances's story begins in 1805 when she was born the younger of two daughters to Judge Elijah Miller. He's pictured right over here. Judge Miller was a wealthy Auburn judge, and he built this house at 33 South Street in 1816, right after his wife passed away. He wanted to give his daughters, Frances and Lizette, a very safe place to grow up in. So he also invited his mother and his unmarried sister to come and live with them to help raise the girls. And Frances would consider this her home for the rest of her life. Frances is pictured right over here. So back in the early 1800s, women were normally not given the same educational opportunities as men. Frances and Lizette went to several schools throughout upstate New York, including a Quaker school, but they did not learn such subjects as science, foreign languages, or classic literature. Judge Miller, though, wanted the best of the best for his daughters, so he sent them to the Troy Female Seminary, also known as the Emma Willard School. Emma Willard established the school in 1814, and she, quote, wanted it to be the first school in the country to provide girls the same educational opportunities given to boys. Emma Willard was a very accomplished woman. She faced many obstacles throughout her life, especially as people opposed her plan for improving female education, which she sent to the New York State Legislature. But ultimately, she provided girls the same educational opportunities as boys for the first time. And for Frances, this was a godsend. For the first time, she was able to learn subjects like foreign languages, classic literature, and other subjects which undoubtedly grounded her in the ideals of equality that she carried with her throughout the rest of her life. The Emma Willard School also provided Frances with several other opportunities, including that to make friends. And her first friend there was named Cornelia Seward. Cornelia Seward just so happened to be the younger sister of the dashing man William Henry Seward, who is pictured right over here. So Cornelia invited Frances back home with her to Florida, New York one year, where Frances and William Henry met. And they developed what Henry called a partiality toward each other. And for this reason, Seward just so happened to move to Auburn a few years later, get a job with Judge Miller, and what do you know? Within a year, he had asked Frances to marry him. Judge Miller agreed to this match on one condition, that they both move into this house here at 33 South Street with him. So a lot of people moved into this house at once, but it was a very happy family, especially as the pair had 5 children together. So throughout their marriage, as they watched their children grow up, Mr. and Mrs. Seward actually spent much of their time apart. Mr. Seward moved to Albany and then to Washington as his political career flourished, and Mrs. Seward decided to stay home in Auburn at her permanent address because she was often ill and she didn't really like the social expectations that the capitals brought. However, the two maintained their relationship even with the long distance. Patricia Johnson, biographer, wrote, "Through all of their marriage, William Henry had written her almost daily when they were apart. He kept her informed, shared his hopes and his uncertainties, and sought her advice. When he was home, he read her his speeches and public communications and sought her advice on matters of style and principle. He usually incorporated her suggestions." So it's very clear that Frances was both a political advisor and conscious to Seward even while they were apart. Now, despite the fact that Mr. and Mrs. Seward spent much of their time apart and Mrs. Seward was here for most of her life, this is not to say she was idle when back home in Auburn. As I said, we're standing in the front parlor of the house, which is where Frances met most of the visitors who came in each day to visit. She met people from out of state, former presidents like John Quincy Adams, who is pictured here, and of course, many activists in the social reform movements of which she was a part. Mrs. Seward was very into educational reform, the anti-slavery movement, and the women's rights movement. However, it may come as a shock to many of our viewers that Mrs. Seward did not actually attend the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. It was certainly a shock to me when I found that out. However, Mrs. Seward had a lot on her plate, and this absence was not due to a lack of passion for women's rights at all. It was mainly because of her complicated position as the wife of such an esteemed politician, and perhaps even her involvement on the Underground Railroad. She was the one who established this house as a stop on the Underground Railroad, more so than her husband for sure, and she probably didn't want much attention being brought to her while that was going on here at the house. We are now standing in one of my favorite rooms in the Seward house, the library. There are over 4,000 books in our collection and about 1,500 here in this room. So as I mentioned earlier, Frances and Lizette got a very good education. And as I'm sure you can guess from looking around this room, they hope to instill this passion for education in the next generation of children of the Seward family. Mrs. Seward was particularly intent on educating her only daughter, Fanny. Fanny Seward is pictured up here with her father. She was born in 1844, and she was undoubtedly the favorite of the family. She's still the household favorite today because of her quick-witted humor, her kindness. She's a little bit awkward, but she's still such a kind soul. We also know the most about Fanny because of all of her diary entries. So behind you, you can see all of these books were Fanny's. She was very, very interested in reading and writing. This book contains all of the books that Fanny used when she was homeschooled. She was mainly taught by her mother and by a governess here at the house. She was very widely read. She read everything from fiction to activism books, from Homer, Virgil, Milton, anything you can imagine from her era she had read. And at the same time, she was also a very talented writer, probably because of how much she had read. At the age of 14, Fanny received a diary for Christmas, and ever since then, pretty much every single day, Fanny wrote down in her diary what had happened to her throughout the day. And for this reason, her diaries are a treasure trove for historians. We know everything about her life, about her father's life, about the Civil War in Washington, and about the 19th century in Auburn because of her diary entries. They all show the very unique perspective of a young Victorian girl who was living at the time of the Civil War in America. As you can see in this picture, Fanny was very close with her father, which we also know from her diary entries. While Fanny was very like her mother and spent most of her time here in this house, she and her father were the best of friends, and Seward even described her as his shadow. For this reason, her untimely death at age 21 in 1866 was a devastating one for the family, and especially for Mr. Seward. He described her death as his great unspeakable sorrow. He is the one who established this memorial library for her. So back in the Victorian age, books were kind of a rare commodity, so families tended to trade them with one another or share them with friends. It wasn't very common for people to have a set memorial library where nobody else could exchange the books out of there, and for this reason we have such a complete collection, because Seward decided to honor his daughter in this way. Fanny probably would have become a very successful author had she grown up to achieve her dreams, but unfortunately as a little girl, she was very shy about her talent, so she only published a few short stories in a children's magazine under the fake name Pansy, which we have only recently discovered was her. But the good thing is, though it's a sad irony, today her works are very widely read by historians. We are now standing in possibly the most lavishly decorated room in the house. This is the dining room. This always gets a really great wow factor when people walk in for the first time and see it, especially because we have all different sorts of china that are put out. So this room was actually an addition onto the house. It was put in two parts. The first part was in 1848 and the second part was in 1866. Originally, the dining room was in the basement of the house, but it was moved upstairs when the Sewards realized what a great asset it was to have the dining room here. And that's because the dining room became such an important part of Mr. Seward's political life and career. Mr. Seward, while not the greatest speaker, was possibly the greatest entertainer of his age. He was really, really talented at sitting at the head of his dinner table and entertaining everyone around him and making sure that they all had a great time while at his parties. And for this reason, he became one of the places to be in Auburn, in Albany, and in DC. But he cannot receive all of the credit for hosting these parties. In fact, he kind of bit off a bit more than he could chew when he entered politics. He was busy juggling all of his various duties in Washington especially, and he needed to hire somebody who could help throw these parties for him. This job was usually left to the hostess of the household, who was normally the wife, so Mrs. Frances Seward would have been the one to throw these parties, but as we know, she liked to stay home in Auburn, keep to herself. She probably wasn't into these huge parties. So instead, Mr. Seward had to look elsewhere. And this is where we come to Anna Seward, who's pictured right here. Anna Seward was Mr. Seward's daughter-in-law. She was married to Frederick Seward, his second son. She was born in 1836 and married Frederick in 1854, and she was loved by the entire family. She was creative, she had an eye for color, she was quick on her feet, and she was also very kind. Fanny especially loved Anna, and she wrote that whenever she visited her, she acted somewhat like a sister figure to her, teaching her the ways of society and how to behave at a party, especially when Fanny didn't have very many social skills to work off of. Anna was great at her job, as the hostess of the household, and it was no easy job. She was responsible for watching the letters come into the house, visiting other households on Seward's behalf, often dressed like this, especially when visiting Lincoln's mansion, for example. But at the same time, one of the funnest parts of her job was throwing dinner parties. She was in charge of creating the seating charts for these dinners, where she would put Republicans right next to Democrats, forcing them to talk to each other for long periods of time so that Seward could come and swoop in, take care of the situation, and make everybody happy before they left his house at the end of the day. She was also in charge of creating the menus for the dinners, where these menus included things such as soups, chicken, beef, salads, other normal things. The truth was that they also included very exotic animals. Fanny Seward wrote in her diary when she was 14 of one of these times when she attended a dinner and was served something called terrapin. She soon came to find out that terrapin meant turtles. And she decided that she wasn't going to eat any more animal food for the rest of the meal when she learned about the turtle situation. But nonetheless, people loved coming to Anna's parties. Mrs. Seward wrote that even in the brutal winters in Albany, people would still come from all over to Anna's parties because they had heard so much about them. And as a result, Anna received many gifts for all of her hard work. The first is actually this painting, which was from Mr. Seward as a thank you gift for all that she had done for him. It was painted by Emanuel Loitza, who is best known for Washington crossing the Delaware. She also received this Japanese fan, which is pictured in the painting. And last but not least, she received this set of French imperial china from Prince Jerome of France. The story is that Prince Jerome visited from far away, and he was so blown away by Anna's dinner parties that he decided to give her this set of French imperial china, which is normally reserved only for French royalty. So while Anna was such an amazing hostess, the truth was that she was also a very valued member of the family, not only because of the success that she gave to Mr. Seward, but also because of the happiness that she brought to everyone else's lives, especially Frederick. He wrote that their marriage was a union which has proved the chief element of my life's happiness, which so many hope for and so few attain. So I'm now standing in the drawing room of the Seward House Museum, which again was built in about 1866. The drawing room got its name because it's where the ladies usually withdrew to after having dinner. So you can see that the drawing room comes right off of the dining room very conveniently. after the food was served, the men would normally stay in the dining room, they would smoke cigars and drink brandy, while the women withdrew into here. Now, drawing rooms were more like entertainment rooms or family rooms today. You can see that it's a lot more comfortable, and it's where the family would have stayed to relax. But it was also where Frances might have entertained some of her visitors. Some visitors that might have been entertained in this drawing room included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martha Coffin Wright, and of course Lizette, her sister. But we'll start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So actually in our collection, we have a copy of her 1898 book, 80 Years and More. And in this book, which she has signed to Janet Seward, we'll meet her soon, Stanton describes a story from an Albany dinner that she shared with the Sewards that's quite insightful into what she experienced as a women's suffrage advocate. So she wrote about this story when she was having dinner in Albany with the Sewards and a few other people, where she was sort of the subject of a lot of laughs and jibes and jests because of her views on women's suffrage and divorce reform. Elizabeth Cady Stanton sort of sat there quietly, getting made fun of because of her views. Mr. Seward was one of the people who was making fun of her in this public space, and Frances Seward said nothing the entire time. So clearly, Stanton was not super pleased with Mrs. Seward for this, and she said something to her after dinner when they came into the drawing room. And Mrs. Seward defended herself by saying that she would rather walk up to the cannon's mouth than face her husband's displeasure. And at the same time, Mr. Seward came into the room after dinner as well and went up to Stanton and said, "Listen, you have the argument, but custom and prejudice are against you, and they are stronger than truth and logic." So of course, this is kind of a sad story about the Sewards' reaction to Stanton's outward views about women's rights, but at the same time, it shows a very complicated relationship between public image, politics, and the social reform movements that often women's rights advocates faced during this time. The second person I'm going to talk about was Martha Coffin Wright. The Wrights were very close with the Sewards, and they lived in Auburn with them at around the same time, in the 40s to the 60s. Martha Coffin Wright and Frances Seward were good friends because they shared a lot of views on women's rights and on anti-slavery, while David Wright, her husband, as well as William Henry Seward, worked together on several legal cases. Martha Coffin Wright once wrote about a time that she came over to drop some books off to Frances, and she ended up getting involved in this really complicated conversation with William Henry Seward about a legal case that he was working on at the time. And they ended up talking a lot about how often sympathy conflicts with duty when you're a lawyer and you're trying to defend somebody in the court of law. And as biographers Sherry Penny and James Livingston wrote, Martha Coffin Wright often clearly leaned towards sympathy when it came to cases like this. But at the same time, Mrs. Wright was very steadfast and often blunt about her views when it came to things like anti-slavery. In fact, when President Lincoln was elected, she wrote that she was not very pleased with this outcome because she was afraid of his mean spirit of compromise getting in the way of the end of slavery during the war. And finally, we can't forget about Lizette. Lizette Worden was Mrs. Seward's sister. She was her older sister. And Lizette was much more outspoken than Frances was. She, especially after her husband died, was very outwardly against, prejudice against women and against slavery. And there's a story that after her husband died in 1856, she was put in control of the farm that they owned, and she was in charge of hiring a bunch of new farmers to come and help take care of it with her. But apparently when she was hiring the farmers, after taking a tally of how talented these men were, she asked them what their political affiliation was. She said, "Are you Republican or are you Democrat?" And the truth was that Lizette was only going to hire Republican farmers because after her husband died, she didn't have anybody to represent her views in the voting booth. So she wanted the farmers that she hired to go in and cast their ballots in support of Lizette's views. So I'm now standing in the upstairs hall of the Seward house. This is called the Diplomats Gallery. This is sort of a who's who of who's in politics in the 19th century. All of these pictures were originally in Seward's Washington office, but he brought them back here after he retired to Auburn, 1869. Now the fascinating thing about this Diplomats Gallery is that out of 132 portraits on the walls, there are only 18 which are women. That's 14% roughly, and 2 of them are of Queen Victoria. But I'll encourage you to go to our website, sewardhouse.org, and look at our virtual diplomats gallery and see if you can find the women and learn more about them. I'm now standing in the Victorian bedroom of the Seward House Museum. This was the bedroom of Janet Watson Seward and Will Jr. They're pictured right up here. So Will Jr. was the 4th child of the Sewards, and he married Janet in 1860. And this portrait over here is of Janet on her wedding day. So Janet and Will Jr. were very happy together. Janet was often involved in many of the Seward family activities, including going down to Washington with Fanny and Mrs. Seward when they were visiting. So she had a lot of war experiences for herself, which she actually compiled into a book called Personal Experiences of the Civil War. So she was on the front lines, she was seeing things as they were happening, but at the same time, she and Will Jr. were starting a family together back here in Auburn. On the day after she had her very first child, Janet wrote that she was laying in this bed right here when she woke up and she heard the sound of troops marching down the street. And this was also just shortly after Will Jr. was enlisted in the war. So he was able to stay with Janet and their newborn baby for just a few more days, but then he was sent down to Washington with the rest. He actually went to a camp which was named after their first daughter, and it was called Camp Nellie Seward. Meanwhile, Janet stayed home. She helped form the Ladies' Aid Society of Auburn with Mrs. Seward. They helped to make garments of clothes, bandages, and other things to send to the soldiers, until eventually she also moved down to Washington and lived in a log cabin alongside the 9th New York Heavy Artillery Unit with them. Eventually, she moved back here to Auburn, had a second child, and she and Will Jr. were the only pair to actually have children of this generation. And they're the ones who inherited this house after Mr. and Mrs. Seward passed away. We are now standing in the old kitchen of the Seward house. So this room was originally the kitchen, and the room next door was the dining room, until both of these rooms were moved upstairs to accommodate the great parties that I told you about earlier. After this was no longer the old kitchen of the house, it turned into a storage space. And even more than that, it was most likely one of the places in this house that served as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now here I'm going to make the important distinction about the term abolitionist as it pertains to Mr. Seward and his career. Mr. Seward could not actually be considered an abolitionist. Abolitionists were actually a small part of the population at that time, and they were people who really desired a complete end to slavery everywhere in the United States immediately. Mr. Seward, because of his position as Secretary of State under Lincoln, chose to favor gradual emancipation because he was afraid of havoc being wreaked on the South and its economy, and he also preferred that the Union could be kept together more so to end war than anything else. At the same time, we believe that Frances can be considered an abolitionist. She very much urged her husband to take a stronger stance on anti-slavery, especially during his career as Secretary of State. In one letter that she wrote to him in 1861, she said the following: "My dearest Henry, compromise is based on the idea that the preservation of the Union is more important than the liberty of nearly 4 million human beings cannot be right. Whatever may be the judgment of this generation, this truth will stand out boldly on the pages of history. No one can dread more than I do, yet I could not today assent to the perpetuation or extension of slavery to prevent war." As I said earlier, Frances also oversaw this house as a stop on the Underground Railroad. She saw the safe arrival of passengers as they came into this house and stayed in this basement room. She also spoke with other leaders in the anti-slavery movement around that time. At this time, I'd like to mention one of the most amazing women in United States history, Harriet Tubman. In Auburn, we are very proud to call ourselves history's hometown and the hometown of Harriet Tubman. The house that is today known as the Harriet Tubman House was actually purchased by Harriet Tubman from Mr. Seward. She lived there while she was becoming the great abolitionist hero that she was, inspiring many and helping to the passage of around 100 slaves on the Underground Railroad. Mr. Seward was a great supporter of Harriet Tubman, as was the rest of the Seward family. When Harriet Tubman got into financial troubles, Mr. Seward testified to the courts about her. He wrote the following: "I have known her long, and a nobler, higher, or truer spirit seldom dwells in human form." Up until the end of Seward's life, the two remained in close contact. And when Mr. Seward died, Harriet Tubman was known for attending his funeral. She was toward the back of the crowd, but she could be seen there, crying quietly to herself. For our last room on this tour, I am standing in Mr. Seward's office. On our normal tours of the Seward House Museum, we use this room to discuss Mr. Seward's long-lasting legacy. However, today I'm going to do the same thing for Mrs. Seward. So while William Henry Seward was away, Frances liked to use this room for some quiet thinking and time for herself. She was very well known for traveling around to various places in upstate New York and meeting with the members of the women's rights movement, as I've mentioned earlier. At these meetings, Elizabeth Cady Stanton mentioned that Frances Seward established a rare intelligence in the room, but at the same time, she played a moderating role, where she helped to tone down their fiery pronunciamentos. Mrs. Seward knew how to calm the room and make sure that they were getting their statements across to other people in a gentle, well-mannered tone that was not necessarily to lessen their passion, but more so to make them better heard. Mrs. Seward was also very well known for establishing the New York Married Women's Property Act. Much like Mr. Seward was known for his dining room diplomacy, Mrs. Seward was known for her drawing room diplomacy. Basically, when she went to various meetings in Albany and had dinner there, she would withdraw into the drawing room with the other women, who were normally the wives of various state senators and legislatures, and she would push this bill to them, rally them all up against the fact that women were, up until then, losing their property rights when getting married. Mrs. Seward was very prominent in the process of this bill transforming into a law, and for that we can thank her. The last few months of Mrs. Seward's life were quite complicated. She was down in Washington during the attempt on her husband's life and the assassination of President Lincoln. Though she stayed by his side throughout it all, she underwent a series of shocks following this traumatic event. Mrs. Seward was already prone to poor health, and this circumstance did not help. She ended up passing just a few months later. And although this death was tragic for Mr. Seward and the rest of the family, he honored her wish to be brought back to Auburn, laid to rest in the gardens, and then finally brought to be buried at Fort Hill Cemetery with the rest of her family. Thank you so much for joining me today on our Women's Specialty Tour. This is one of about a dozen tours that the Seward House Museum offers, and which you can read about on our website. They can even be done on demand when you come to visit for a tour. We really look forward to seeing you soon, and again, thank you so much.